So, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Parabellum. As you can see, I'm here with Colonel Stirpe. Moro is having some problems with his cell phone, but he'll be back soon. And Capitini, on the other hand, has back pain, so he couldn't come. But maybe Marco Bossi will come too. He'll join in when he can. Because anyway, he mainly deals with issues about semiconductor chips and also semiconductor materials. Surely something is happening in this mess. Here comes Daniele again, hopefully. There he is, Daniele.
Hi, Daniele.
Are you there, Daniele?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you loud and clear.
Daniele, I hear him.
You're a little slow on our end, but it's okay. We're used to working with lag. Don't worry. Let's start with the issue that the Colonel raised right away. That is, right now, Trump has until May 1st to basically either finish it or request an extension, because American presidents have 60 days to manage a war that hasn't received authorization to be waged. The question we were asking was exactly whether Trump would start over, request an extension, or completely ignore everything. And the Reuters agency says that some analysts, not on Trump's side but from Congress, think that most likely he will tend to ignore it, instead of seeking approval from Congress. I wonder if he, since everything is kind of in position, let's say that CENTCOM also sends out trailers that are a bit reminiscent of those from Ukraine's 2023 offensive about their actions in the Hormuz blockade. If this is a problem for Trump, do you think, Giorgio, he won't care? Or will he use this deadline to resume the war instead of going to ask for an extension?
That's a good question, because the problem is that there's a military answer, which is the one that in theory should be my area. But there's also an answer purely from intelligence, from the analysis of the character and his political profile. From a strictly military point of view, I don't see the problem. You ask Congress. The extension, the extra month, justified precisely by the fact that there are ongoing negotiations, could lead to a diplomatic solution to the conflict while maintaining military pressure. From a military point of view, this would be by far the most obvious thing to do. But then we have to deal with the psychological profile of the character we're talking about. I know that you're not supposed to gather intelligence on friendly forces and that officially the United States is still a friendly allied country. But it was President Trump himself who put us in a position where we had to make our own assessments, as if he were at least a neutral player, if not even a hostile one. So can we allow ourselves to do at least a little analysis of him? Given the way Trump is, my personal feeling is that he would rather do anything than bow to an authority that he considers inferior to him, because he says that the President of the United States does whatever he wants. Frankly, I think it's more likely that he will completely ignore the deadline, possibly instructing his many aides to justify it afterwards. Saying that the conflict is currently in a ceasefire situation, and therefore the 2-month deadline is suspended until any possible resumption of hostilities. So he simply ignores it completely because he thinks he's above these things. And he will force Exit and possibly Rubio to appear before the Senate with this fig leaf, because that's what it is. And at that point, he goes into a confrontation with Congress and once again forces the Republican majority to take a stand. Either with him or against him, which for him is normal, a test of loyalty for the members of his own party. He will lose some support once again, but he will probably still manage to survive politically and limp his way to the midterm elections.
Yes, also because there is a law, the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which says that the President of the United States can undertake military action only for 60 days before ending it unless he goes to Congress for authorization, or by seeking a 30-day extension due to unavoidable military necessities related to the security of the United States Armed Forces. This second sentence is very interesting because if you look at exactly what the debate in the Senate was about, what a coincidence. They're talking specifically about the safety of the men involved.
I'm going to pause you there. I'm going to give you a chance.
You're disparaging me, saying I don't care. I'm asking you whether you think they're liars or not. That's what I asked. You are disparaging me, saying I don't care about the passing of our troops.
No, I asked if you think they're liars.
That's disparaging and smearing in every way. Nobody cares more about the fate of our troops. Nobody cares about the health of our troops. Nobody wants to bring them all home.
Harry, I understand, but he controls the time. He controls the time.
Note that the president of the Senate is a Republican, and despite this, he tried to, well, contain him. Let's say he was a bit out of control. It's interesting because even to questions like when you made the strategic assessment about Zelensky, who didn't have the cards, what did you base it on? Since it's been over a year and they're still there fighting. And he completely dodged that question and came out with a, well, now the Europeans are paying for the weapons. I mean, that's not a direct answer to what was asked. But it's interesting that he said he really cares a lot about the lives of the men who are serving. Because as it happens, the clause that allows for the extension is related to the safety of the United States Armed Forces. So, in my opinion, considering that he's not exactly a genius, he already more or less had in mind which direction he needed to take in the discussion, because he brings up the topic and then probably this topic will be used. Daniele, can you manage? Is your connection stable? Daniele, can you hear us? Listen.
All right, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
So, I agree. Yes, I agree. In the lineage that you don't, let me stop you there. But it's obvious that it doesn't stop. I'll add a detail.
We can't hear you. Try turning off your video.
I never called for war. Thank you. In my opinion, given...
I don't think he can make it. Just turn off the video. In my opinion, even just the audio is fine. I'll write it down maybe. I'll take this opportunity while he's catching up, and I'll tell you not to use the video if the connection can't handle it. To also see the change, in Trump's posture now that the break is almost over. It's worth noting that CENTCOM is starting to put out trailers, things that make it clear. In short, they're ready. There are some journalistic sources like Axios that say they've spoken with some, as usual, well-informed sources. That basically, if the negotiations don't go through, they intend to carry out a second round of attacks to see if maybe then they'll be more inclined. In my opinion, there's also a two-pronged strategy, right, Giorgio? The Iranian stockpiles of what they're producing can't go much further. I mean, either they shut down, stop everything, or they basically exceed their own stockpiles. And that can be a big problem. I think that's also part of the American strategy, this block to the block, let's say.
But the Iranians actually, from a strictly military point of view, are in a relatively easy position. because they are in a situation where there is no ground conflict, so there is no risk of losing territory. The conflict is exclusively in terms of firepower, and they are a dictatorship. They don't need popular support. So, in theory, they can even afford to bury their heads in the sand, pull their helmets down over their eyes, and take all the hits the Americans can give them. They can even afford not to respond, or to respond in a purely symbolic way, holding on to what they have left in the tunnels, which is still significant, even if it's less than half of what they had before at the beginning of the conflict, and wait for the Americans to finish, to let off steam. The risk is that the Americans use up more ammunition than they can afford to spend without achieving any political result at all. Remember, war isn't fought just for military reasons, but for political ones. Now, they can win militarily as much as they want, but if they don't achieve a political goal that they set for themselves and also promoted, it's not a victory. Especially if it costs them the depletion of ammunition stocks that they need to face challenges much more important than the Iranian ones. So frankly, now I expect that if military operations start again, and the latest proposal that seems to have been sent by the Iranians in Pakistan does not meet Trump's approval, I expect another round of American and Israeli bombings on Iran. They will destroy a lot of things. They won't suffer any losses while carrying out these bombings, but in reality, they won't achieve any results of political value. At most, they might eventually be able to say, yes, we achieved the result. We completely destroyed their uranium reserves. They've already said it once, they can say it again. And this could be a political escape hatch for Trump to get out of the quagmire. But it's unlikely that they'll actually be able to achieve this result. Now, here we should focus more on an economic analysis rather than a military one, and see how long the United States can afford to maintain this kind of pressure. Because here, I'm not an economic analyst, but to say that the United States produces oil and therefore doesn't care if the traffic through the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, is interrupted, I don't think that's accurate. It might not be true, because in any case, energy prices rise because global markets are interconnected. And so in the end, prices go up in America as well. And we know very well that if there's one thing an American president can't allow, it's for the price of gasoline within the United States to rise above a certain threshold. I don't recall, but I think it's about $100 per barrel.
We're already last.
Yes, no, at the pump in the United States.
No, at the pump.
If it goes past that $4 mark,
Gallons, it's $4 a gallon, something like that.
if it goes over that threshold, the president loses the election. That's kind of a benchmark for those who know about it. But I don't remember what the limit is. We would need an economic analyst to tell us what the actual situation is and how long the United States can afford to continue this crisis. It's also true that Iran can't afford it either. But let's go back to the point that Iran is a dictatorship, and in theory, even if half its population starves to death, thank you. The clique in power doesn't really care.
Let's see if Daniele is here. Can you do it?
I can hear you.
Yes, go ahead.
Can you hear me? So, as I was saying, he never accepted the idea that he's waging a war. So probably what Colonel Stirpe is saying is the game he has in mind. That is, I ask for 30 more days, knowing that the Republican representatives will say yes to anything I ask for. And by the way, let me point out,
I think it's lagging. There are some pretty big problems with the connection, and he's in Washington.
Right?
No, I don't think so. I don't know where he is. I think he's at home because it looks like a home setting, not a hotel or something like that. An interesting point is the reserves, because how long can this little game go on?
I went to take a look at the reserves of the various countries, at least the latest estimate, which was still from 2025.
25. And China had 400 million barrels in state reserves, and the rest, let's say, available to private companies. But for China, they're pretty much the same thing. The Americans are the second best off. If you look at everyone else, especially the Europeans, we're completely out of the picture. Keep in mind that even at the current consumption rate, the Chinese had at most 80 days. I mean, we're not talking about years or anything like that. Europe had enough for about 27 days, and this war is costing us something like 500 million a month, something like that in terms of increases. Not the cost of gasoline. So either the Chinese knew and were expecting something, because they accumulated a lot of reserves when oil was low in the previous months, October, November, and so on. Another thing, maybe you remember an old American document where after the Soviet bloc collapsed, the Americans thought there was no need to maintain all those reserves, which used to be much bigger. Because in the future, anyway, if there was going to be a war, more or less, the warning period was 57 years. It seems to me that here it's 57 weeks. And so suddenly that reckless decision to lower the reserves and maybe who knows how many other things, probably even the ammunition, things like that, are starting to weigh on us.
Well, here I really feel like making two observations. One, beyond all the political and ethical considerations that can be made, and with all my personal aversion towards the Iranian regime from a military point of view, in this war, the United States is the aggressor. From a strictly military point of view, I repeat, don't all attack me. I know very well that the Ayatollahs are a criminal regime. The moment I decide to start a military operation in which I have absolute superiority, I decide to wage war, I decide when to start it, I decide how to do it. But is it possible that someone wouldn't prepare for this war? But is it possible that they don't first increase their reserves in order to prepare for a prolonged conflict, which you never know, could last longer than expected? Here is yet another demonstration that the Trump administration is truly a bunch of sorcerers, apprentices, and rank amateurs. Second observation, and here again I'm stepping out of my field for a moment, I would need a colleague who is an economic analyst. But looking at this table, it makes me wonder. The various players listed, China, the United States, Japan, Europe, Saudi Arabia, and so on, are different from each other and have different economic and production systems. They're different from one another. So the use of oil as such is different and has a different significance. For example, here in Europe, oil is basically used. I'm open to criticism and corrections, but roughly speaking, I'd say it's for road transport. So it's not like everything stops if the reserves are greatly reduced. In other countries, oil is also used to provide energy to factories, while here we use gas. So it's also possible that China has much larger reserves than others because its industry relies more on hydrocarbons to provide energy. That could also be the case. I'm not sure about it at all. I'm just putting it out there for discussion.
I think it's partly because they produce less oil than others, and also because they have huge reserves since they're such a large country, so they consume a huge amount.
For example, I know that they have the largest coal consumption in the world.
Yes.
something that we almost don't have anymore. And India, same thing. So I don't know how indicative the total level of available stocks is compared to what is actually consumed and the primary need.
Where did Daniele go? To the bar?
Sorry, what? No.
I was watching where Daniele went to the square, to the bar, to steal Wi-Fi from some bar.
Probably.
Go ahead, Daniele. Now I think if you're at the bar, we can hear you. Let's see if he can hear us. Thank you. Daniele. No, while he recovers, I'll take this opportunity to bring up another topic. Lately, we have Israel, and in the meantime, a couple of side news stories that I think are quite interesting. One, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates have left OPEC Plus. And above all, they have started to receive air defense systems. The Israelis, it seems, are also sending troops for their defense. Is it a change of boss, of master, a shift in dependence? Or is it, as Aldo Giovanni and Giacomo would say, are they upending the table here?
But I would say that the United Arab Emirates are following a policy very similar to that of the European nations. They are diversifying their la loro dipendenza so that they no longer depend on a single player. The Emirates have been, let's say, quite burned by the way the Americans handled the conflict. They almost completely agree on the conflict, not on the political initiative to really hit Iran hard. But they are also deeply dissatisfied with the American handling of the conflict, which has left them much more exposed than they expected. And so they are diversifying. And when you want to diversify your alliances and you don't want to be dependent on an autocracy like Russia or China, you don't have many cards to play. There are the United States in the region, there's Israel, which is a certainty from a military point of view, and then there's Europe. Now, the Gulf countries have started to diversify, starting with Europe. They started to make deals, to sign contracts with various European nations, first of all, Italy, France, and now they're also doing it with Israel. I would say it's an absolutely pragmatic view on how to face a world where the United States is no longer a certainty. It's yet another sign that Trump is destroying the United States' hegemonic position in the world, turning America's position into that of a continental power. With its sphere of influence no longer extending over the entire planet, but competing with others. This is because he has destroyed soft power. He has destroyed the unconditional trust that the United States enjoyed from most nations. One can argue whether it was well placed or not. And that's why the United Arab Emirates have decided that now there are some things that the United States no longer guarantees, that they no longer handle best. Who at this moment gives the impression of having the best air defense in the world? Israel. After Israel, who comes next? Ukraine. The Gulf countries are signing contracts with Israel, with Ukraine, and with Italy, and with other European countries, so that dependence on the United States is no longer absolute. When they see that for the conflict against Iran, Patriot missiles are being diverted from one ally to another overnight, they rightly ask themselves, but if tomorrow the United States is involved in a conflict in the Pacific, and we have a problem with Iran again, who will give us the Patriots?
Same question that came up for Ukraine. One of the first things I brought up when this mess started was perfect. Now there are other competitors for the Patriots, for the air defense systems. In fact, Ukraine didn't like this whole Iran story at all because they immediately understood what was coming and tried to get involved with an offer to provide operators and so on to stay in the game, so to speak. But there aren't enough Patriots for everyone from what we can see. Taiwan would like them too. Others want them as well. So one goes.
And this means that Patriots can no longer be the only answer. By the way, have you followed the latest news, the latest agency reports about the downing of the Kinzhals by the Ukrainians?
Not with Patriots, but with systems.
Finally, electronic ones. People are organizing. We need to see if it's true.
We need to do some tests. For example, it happened with the HIMARS. The Russians were jamming the Excalibur shells too, if I remember correctly, used by the M777s, and then slowly. The news was also confirmed, let's say, from the Western side that basically the levels of accuracy had dropped. So much so that at a certain point, the Ukrainians didn't even want the Excalibur shells anymore, also because they cost a fortune. They preferred regular shells. So if the news is true, then we need to see what level of effectiveness it has. Now, since we have an expert on these things here, Marco, what do you think about this whole story about jamming Kinzhal missiles?
I don't know the details, let's say, of these things, because obviously many of these images are classified. It's clear that you can jam anything. So any radio signal you pick up, especially on a narrow band, and especially if you're using systems that aren't particularly sophisticated,
you can jam it, but there's a time frame to do it. I mean, if that thing comes down at Mach 5, Mach 7, and so on, and you add the electronics,
compared to mechanical quantities, electronic quantities are thousands of times faster, always anyway. So you have to see then if you have to see how it works. I practically know nothing about how that thing works, but what we're basically witnessing, let me just say, this is something we said a long time ago, that the electronics we find in all these contexts are part of something new and part of something that's a legacy from the past. We talked about it on one of your shows a few days ago, or maybe a few weeks ago now, and that many in the US are still putting money into systems that are now legacy. And that many of the things to translate it are, sponsor me, I always hear these terms, you have it forever.
No, not just a bit legacy. Even if you use an Italian term, the fact is that weapon systems are produced and then people try to work on them and improve them. And so you have to maintain them also because it costs less. Like most missiles, if you look at how Russian missiles are made, they either have parts in common with the Bulava, or you see the whole Cage series, which, for better or worse, some parts go back to the 70s because maybe there's nothing wrong with a part dating back to the 70s, if it works. But building on top of an existing weapon system is the best way to spend less, also because there's already a production line and so on. But they also have maintenance costs as they reach the end of their service life. I mean, trying to keep something going is a bit like trying to keep a Fiat 500 alive. Yes, you can do it, but by now it's more of an artistic thing than anything else. However, looking at it,
specifically, you need to see if the thing has been studied and which generation the control system is from. For example, the flight control or feedback system or any other kind of system. If we were talking, in fact, a long time ago in the telecommunications sector about the fact that there are 10 trillion in market capitalization just to keep mobile communications running. There's an enormous amount of sophistication involved. Now imagine a radio signal, maybe developed by a small research bureau in some office in Russia. They had to set up a communication system that is actually sophisticated, but it can be cloned. It can't operate over a wide band. You can do frequency hopping, but even there, sooner or later, the old frequencies they're working on. The first one, what's it called? The first option you find, go check how the electronics are made, understand which band the filters are on, if they're working, and obviously reconstruct the frequencies they're working on. So in the end, unless you have something extremely sophisticated and flexible, and so unless they're electronics of the very latest generation, and even the systems that transmit must work on this very latest generation, I see it as tough, basically. I mean, anything that's legacy, that's, as we said, old or an evolution of the past is still subject to this kind of very rapid obsolescence. Look at GPS. You were talking earlier about everything that uses GPS. Now, there are techniques coming out to improve, let's say, resilience, resistance to attempts at obfuscation, at spoofing. Not to mention, of course, jamming, but specifically spoofing, where you make the missile or the munition believe it's at one point, while in reality it's somewhere else, and so on. And these aren't crazy technologies. I remind everyone that you just have to look on YouTube. There are some amazing pranks you can do with a Raspberry and a €250 SDR. And there are some software programs you can put on the Raspberry, and your friend who's in the car in front of you, the one you're following, you can make him believe he's in the middle of the Nevada desert. So you can really make him go wherever you want simply by obfuscating GPS signals. This is something that's totally doable. So obviously everything that's connected in this field can be thrown off. And sorry, I went on for too long.
No, the Russians did it, as we said earlier, with the HIMARS, with the Excalibur shells guided by GPS. In the end, a missile moving at that speed doesn't need to be diverted by much. A change of 0.001 degrees already means missing by hundreds of meters, or it's cumulative. It's cumulative, especially when you're flying like that at Mach 7, but I'm always the kind of person who doesn't believe it until I see it, meaning they say there have been 26 tests, but there aren't any. It's true that lately in the last 3 or 4 months you haven't really heard much about Kinzhal. I've always seen in the official reports that 2, 4, and 6 of them were launched. I should go and double check by looking at every time a Kinzhal hit a target to see how many were launched and declared, how many we can verify actually hit a target, and how many went off course. Compared to the total over the last 4 months, they say since the beginning of the year, so more or less the last 5 months now, almost 4. We'll see. It will definitely be something interesting to check, and we'll dive into it with Fontana to see. But ask me, I'll also check with my contacts in Ukraine, because usually the local newspapers report if a missile has hit here or there. It's not like everything is centralized from a communication point of view.
A lot.
Big difference, right? This whole big story about Kinzhal, in the end,
No, it's just that we're obviously talking about details. I'd also like to add, to reassure those who always say I'm too optimistic, let's also keep in mind that finding an ECM solution, an electronic warfare solution, to neutralize a missile is not the solution against that missile. It's the solution for the moment. Then probably when the users themselves realize what the system is, they in turn can probably with some ease find a countermeasure. And so it will go on further.
Actually, sorry to interrupt you, but when the Ukrainians say that they've stopped 26, it's very likely because the Russians have already changed by now. You wouldn't have any reason to say something like that unless it's already happened and things have already changed. But in fact,
here Marco can probably confirm the real war. From an electronic point of view, it's really about making sure that the opponent is forced to add another gadget to their weapon system, making it more and more expensive and increasingly complex to build. And so in the long run, making it obsolete. That's what happened with the Shahad drones, which at first cost very little. Then, by constantly adding countermeasures to respond to Ukrainian countermeasures, it became more and more expensive. And in the end, the Russians had to start building their own versions, different, separate, and distinct. No longer legacy, as you rightly said, Marco.
I can tell you that, wait, I'm also reading the comments below. I didn't want to talk about it today because I wanted to do more research, but since we brought it up, the producer also stated that the Lima system diverted 33 cruise missiles and 10,000 drones in the first quarter of this year. I find that a bit unlikely, to be honest, and also 98% of the guided aerial bombs launched in the areas covered by the system. I know because 2 days ago I was looking at the latest satellite images from some analysts who sit there and check where all the bombs have gone. And there were like 600 this month just on the front between Zaporizhia, Pokrovsk, and so on. So these numbers here already don't make sense compared to the visual evidence from just the bomb craters. Well, unless they mean that it diverted them, meaning it made them miss a bit. The problem is most of the aerial bombs that are dropped are glide bombs. Yes, they also have the system, but most of them glide toward a known position, so I don't even think they use GLONASS at this point. It's an extra feature, but usually they're already, let's say, pre-calculated to glide in a certain direction. At most, you just make some corrections.
Out of 10,000, they should have mechanical and preset guidance, so they can't be influenced.
There's also GLONASS potentially, which can do some of that, but usually the ones that are used are mechanical, usually.
Because GLONASS works.
Well, there's a margin of error of 10 meters, but when you drop a FAB 3000, you don't really care if it hits 10 meters to the left or 50 to the right. We're right there.
Let's say that going back to what Georgia was saying, in my opinion, it's true, some leaps that force your opponent to take a countermeasure. But those are the most effective ones. I want to give an example. Going quite far back in time, the SA-2S in Vietnam were not systems that required minor countermeasures. Let's say the temporary solution was the electronic warfare pods. But in fact, then, the Americans had to come up with stealth, which wasn't exactly a technology that arrived after just a few years. So you have to see how long the temporary solution lasts compared to how long a more pervasive and generational change solution lasts. In this case, if you use GLONASS as a system, apart from the fact that GLONASS isn't that adaptable, to my knowledge, you basically have to develop electronics that are able to understand whether you're being spoofed or not, just like it happens with GPS, right? How do you do GPS spoofing, let's say? If I had my nice constellation of satellites and suddenly some satellites appear that have nothing to do with it, it's clear that someone is trying to fool me. And so that's what the PNT correction systems that you have to install on board do. By the way, the company I work for produces a whole range of these devices. They actually acquired a company specialized in this field.
I'm taking advantage of Daniele being here because then we can talk calmly about how the connection works there. But it only takes 20 or 40 minutes to try. We're in agreement.
We go in and out. He went into the bar. He was heard reciting the rosary, let's say live, even telepathically.
Around the Wi-Fi in 80 days. So Daniele, besides the fact that you need to keep telling us what you were saying about him, I also have a question. What is this story about the ex's attack? The former FBI chief against Trump. How did this come out now? How come? How is it? Daniele, are you ready?
Yes, the umpteenth one. Can you hear me? The umpteenth episode of revenge that, let's say, it's been 12 years since Trump officially entered politics. Who basically, on every occasion, calls for Hillary Clinton to be arrested to put the former head of the CIA and the former head of the FBI in prison. When the other former FBI director, Mueller, died a few weeks ago, Trump, with his usual bad taste, said he was really glad he died. So there was an analysis done this morning specifically about this Comey case, where it seems that Trump had asked the Department of Justice to have him arrested and brought back in chains. Comey, who clearly figured it out, showed up on his own before this whole show came out. It's clear that Comey made a mistake because this sign he posted and then removed was actually a really bad, how should I say, it was something that a former FBI director shouldn't have done.
Yes, it seems so. It goes to black. Today, I think Daniele's phone is blowing up, but did he manage to finish it right?
At least at this point, yes.
Ah, how good. Yes, that's great. If he can at least finish a complete sentence, that's fine with us. That's it. Poor Moro, who's always connecting from somewhere and has these kinds of problems. But yes, interesting. So, an arrest warrant for the former head of the FBI. Usually, it's the head of the FBI who issues arrest warrants. Here, it's the other way around. But this, from a certain point of view, this is where I want your input, Giorgio, from intelligence, shows us that there's total nervousness. I mean, you're dealing with a big player like Iran, you're enforcing a blockade, and you still have time to worry about the former head of the FBI. For things like this, while they keep firing a lot of people from a military and intelligence point of view and so on, Hexit is what he is. We've seen it. So I understand that any career general, when someone like that shows up and tries to shout orders at you, you'd want to slap him twice and send him home. But this is the state of things. And in my opinion, there's a big gap here, right? I mean, the military knew very well what the situation was. The removal of the chief of staff is proof of that. And on the other hand, politically, you're under a political diktat and you still have to do what you're ordered to do. So you who have a military career, how do you manage to reconcile the two things when you know that the order you're given is idiotic and you can't achieve it? I know this is something you remember well. You found yourself in that situation in Libya.
Well,
Here I'm clearly giving my very personal opinion. The United States has the fundamental charter, the Constitution, which is basically a document from the late 1700s and has undergone very few revisions. The famous amendments, most of which are also very old. The system of checks and balances in the American system is extremely sophisticated. It's a historical example for the world, but it's dated. When it was conceived and gradually refined, the world moved at a slower pace. So the timelines set by the American system leave room for those who take advantage of the gray areas created today by modern technology, modern society, and current systems. Now, Trump has learned to live like a shark in the American political and economic sphere, taking advantage of the gray areas in the legislation. The political Trump has learned to operate in the gray areas, not of jurisdiction anymore, but of the Constitution. Taking advantage of the fact that the American constitutional system gives the President of the United States powers that are limited. Yes, by Congress, but they are limited ex post. In the sense that the President gives an order, and even if that order seems questionable, you still have to carry it out. Then, if necessary, Congress will take care of fixing things if it concludes that the President has exceeded his authority. The problem, however, is that nowadays, by the time Congress intervenes, the issue is already practically settled and Congress is faced with a fait accompli. And so the presidential system ends up making the executive power prevail over Parliament, over the legislative branch. Because of the speed with which the orders it issues are carried out. In European systems, the situation is different because when the head of government gives an order, he has to obtain approval in advance. Authorization from Parliament. So for me as a soldier, it becomes easy to obey or not because I have an order from the executive power endorsed by the legislative power. Fine, there's no discussion. It really has to be an illegal order, clearly illegal, that I refuse to obey. And in any case, I'm protected when I refuse to obey because the rules allow me to refuse a clearly illegitimate order. In America, it's not like that because in America, as a soldier, you have to obey your chain of command, which is headed by the POTUS, the commander-in-chief, who, I repeat, answers to Congress only after the fact. He doesn't need immediate authorization. So as a soldier, the moment I realize that the order I'm receiving in America is nonsense, it's wrong, it's harmful to my country and to the integrity of my armed forces, I can only point it out.
Yes, by the way, X said a couple of months ago also had a lot of army lawyers removed because, in my opinion, they already knew that many would go there, and those are exactly the ones who should support a soldier when he finds himself in a situation like this. So there's also a bit of premeditation, knowing that there would be resistance.
Of course, but there's also the fact that if I myself don't want to obey this order, I have only one option: to resign. But if I resign, I'm also aware that he will put someone less suitable than me in my place just because they will obey him. And so I, who am responsible for the lives of my men, also have to ask myself, if I resign, am I not putting even more of my own personnel's lives at risk? Doesn't it cause even greater harm to my country? Trump is really putting American soldiers in an ethically unsustainable situation. And my personal disgust toward him comes mainly from this. I feel also, because I'm still in touch with some of them, the suffering of my American colleagues. I really suffer with them because they have no way out.
They don't know what to do in a situation like this. They find themselves in a bind.
They are in a situation with no way out. If they resign, it's an escape from responsibility. But if they don't resign, they have to obey blatantly wrong orders.
Sorry, this way I'm also answering this question. A Norwegian military officer in an article from Article, I'm not sure if that's really written in Italian, then wrote that the Russian fleet is very large and advanced. Thank you. Which one? The one that's underwater in the Black Sea? Because most of it ended up down there. Submarine field? Yes, it's advanced. You have to admit it. They've always invested in the submarine field and managed to maintain a certain level, even though they've struggled a lot.
Anyway, they don't have many left now.
In terms of numbers, it's not a great navy. In fact, historically, the Russian Navy has never done much, neither in World War II nor in the 20th century. The few times they've tried, greetings to Otsushi, but let's just say it's not really their thing. Submarine warfare is a different story. In that area, they were definitely very advanced. At least until the mid-1980s, they were really at the forefront. Today, let's turn to that. There's little left of it. The submarine fleet, yes, and in fact, there's an ongoing struggle between... I mentioned a collaboration between the British and Norwegians to deter Russian submarine activity in the North Sea, but also, I believe, in the Baltic. It should be said that Finland was neutral, but together with Norway and Sweden, and so on, they placed so many acoustic buoys and underwater sensors that basically, if a Soviet submarine passed by,
They knew exactly where it was. You could practically walk on top of it.
and that's true, they knew very well what was moving. Let's say that when you go out into the North Sea, it's already a bit bigger.
In the Arctic, the situation is different. But I'd remind your contact that when the Kursk sank, even just to recover the wreck, they had to ask the Norwegians for help.
Falando se non
Olandesi
avessero,
c'erano, o norvegesi?
if they hadn't waited, they would have saved them too.
Exactly.
That they waited for days and so on about the Kursk tragedy. A fleet really is a pain, because even just one nuclear submarine is enough to be a pain, especially if it's an SSBN launching strategic missiles and so on. But it's not a fleet that, let's say, puts any country in trouble. Think about it. The Russian naval strategy, designed for the Cold War, was we pack the ships to the gills, and if we clash with the American Navy, we fire everything we can to take as many scalps as possible at the Americans, because we knew that the rest of the fleet would be sunk, so it was almost like a suicide mission.
And the Russian Navy operates on borrowed time for an operational site.
I was reading that the Baltic is very shallow, so basically it's easy. The only outlet is Murmansk.
Which means that any Russian naval unit operating in the Arctic, where it's hard to find, sooner or later still has to go refuel. And it can only go to refuel at a single naval base at the end of a fjord that everyone knows where it is. So once it's out, it has to complete its mission, knowing that it won't be able to carry out any other. So the Russian naval threat against Norway is something that can last a month or two, after which only those 4 nuclear submarines remain available. Wait, those last much more than 4 months, but it's like Raider-style warfare, like what the Germans did during World War II, nothing more.
They matter more strategically than as a nuisance.
But if you can interfere with the Black Sea Fleet, that's serious trouble.
Calm down. Don't provoke me. I already see things heating up in the Kiev, Kirov, Minsk, and Sverdlov sectors. Don't worry, I know it by heart. In the midst of everything that's happening, there's also this statement from Trump. The United States is studying and reviewing, let's put it that way, the possibility of reducing. The troops in Germany, which had already been reduced since the 1990s, are being reduced again. They had been slightly increased with the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, if I remember correctly, from 45,000 to 55,000, something like that. So these kinds of signals, or the fact that at some point Donald Trump said, let's kick Spain out of NATO, there's actually no mechanism to kick a country out of NATO. No. He doesn't want to leave anymore. He wants to kick everyone else out, kind of like the cuckoo bird. Do you know how the cuckoo chick works? It's placed in the nest and then it throws all the others out.
In theory, there is the mechanism of suspension, but it has to be approved by a majority, basically unanimously, by the Atlantic Council. That means all the nations, the other nations, they all have to agree to suspend a member. And it's much more likely that everyone would agree to suspend the United States than to reach an agreement. If we listen to Trump, we'd suspend Spain. So let's drop it. We're really at the point of being ridiculous. Only those who are convinced that NATO is the property of the United States, who do whatever they want with it, can believe that. And let's leave their beliefs aside. We know very well that's not the case. Even the reduction of forces in Germany, by the way, as far as I know, requires the approval of Congress. So here again, we'll end up in a situation where he can give an order that, as we know, isn't entirely legitimate. How will this end? Once again, an institutional clash in America. So now here it's Trump making another outrageous claim. And it's like he's playing a gigantic global strategy game. He has the biggest toy in the world at his disposal. The United States of America, with all their tools, including the military ones, which amuse him the most. And he wants to play in the biggest playground in the world, which unfortunately for us is the world. But he doesn't really realize what he's doing.
Question for Giorgio, not for Oreo, only his enemies call him Oreo. In 3 years, could these dismissed generals be reinstated in a new administration? How do you recover from the disaster?
Clearly, if Congress were to pass some law that creates an administrative mess, in theory, of course, the legislative branch can do it. And if it has the president's approval, it can be done. But it would be a huge problem to call back into service people who in the meantime have already been replaced by others. So I, General B, am called to replace General A, who has been dismissed. At the moment when General A is called back, I, General B, who am not at fault and am in my new position.
By now they've reassigned you and so on, you've burned all your bridges, go back?
Administratively, it's a nightmare.
Also because Puglia was in a top position, I mean, you can't just take a chief of staff and send him back.
All they can do is what's called a career review and grant him purely administrative redress. But it's not possible to put them back in the position they were in. Unfortunately, these people are victims of a situation, of a historical condition that put them in that historical position.
He just gave us another gem, breaking news. But this opens up a big debate. In my opinion, the Americans have occupied us here in Italy. We've declared war. For us, do you think military expenses go up or down? Let's see if we use a bit of logic. We have a big Ormus.
We have a Hormuz of our own. Off the coast of Sicily, we have Hormuz nearby. We depend on our sea routes for import and export. Fortunately, we trade more with Europe than with the rest of the world. But a large part of our imports comes from overseas. It comes from other seas then.
It's no coincidence that we have the wider Mediterranean, very wide indeed, so wide that you can't cover it with just 3 frigates. People often don't consider it, but I too am for an independent Italy, one that has its own strategic value, its own geopolitics, and that can also exercise it. The problem is you need to have strength, real strength. Free things don't exist. If you find, let's say, strategic freedom without weapons, let me know, because I've never seen it in history. If they leave, we would have to spend not what we're spending now, but much more. We'd go back to the spending levels of the 90s. If that's what we want, then yes, we'd have to spend that much.
But that's from our point of view. From the American point of view, though, the discussion is even more interesting because, let's say, the United States withdraws its forces. At that point, an administrative nightmare comes up. Because what happens to all the American hardware, to the American-owned infrastructure that's in Europe? And what happens to them? Do they leave them on lease? Do we nationalize them? Do they leave a man on guard?
We have an example, right, Giorgio, that of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The countries inherited, for better or worse, most of it, even if then the bulk went back, let's say, to the manufacturer, that is Poland. At a certain point, it found itself with dozens of useless bases, which they didn't even know what to do with because they used to host a gigantic army.
There are things that you simply can't dismantle and take back across the Atlantic, but above all, there's also a purely strategic aspect. Now, beyond everything else, the United States basically needs Europe because it's an operational base from which they exercise their global strategic supremacy over the entire planet. If they voluntarily lose their bases in Europe, for example, just to mention Trump's policy, how are they going to support Israel?
That would be interesting. The thing is, where would they start from? We should do a nice live stream about it. L'America senza the ability to project power. We take away all their bases in Europe.
Do you remember that data we published during the live stream we did? All the 10,000 sorties they carried out during the Epic Fury campaign all departed from Europe, from European bases. It's inevitable.
The aircraft carriers did very little. Geopolitically, Europe is still positioned at the center. The United States, geographically, is somewhere else for them to project power over the rest of the world. Without Europe, without the possibility of basing themselves in Europe, of using Europe as a hub, they can no longer do it in the Middle East. They no longer matter at all. The day after they leave the European bases, they can't even reach Diego Garcia anymore. They completely lose the Middle East, East Africa, Southern Africa, the entire Indian Ocean. They can project power as far as the island of Guam. And in the Atlantic, only as far as West Africa. That's it.
There's another issue. The war in Iraq has shown that aircraft carriers are starting to show all their signs of fatigue when it comes to war. Because we've seen that aircraft carriers have to stay more than 800 miles from the coast due to problems, obviously well beyond the 550-mile range of the F-35s for obvious vulnerability issues.
And without the European bases, where would the Ford go to take shelter? Forget about the Suda Bay. It would have had to go all the way back to Norfolk. Maybe it would just be getting there now, limping along.
Ma io sono
Non
convinto
so,
che
Paolo.
I'm sure the era of aircraft carriers ended a while ago, as I mentioned. I see the Chinese racing to build carriers kind of like the race for the super ships back in the 30s. And it was already obsolete and we didn't realize it. There were even analysts and military historians who were already writing about this in the 20s when they were experimenting with the first British aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers don't make sense. They attack you from 1,000 kilometers away. You don't even see them. It's absolutely better to build those. And I see maybe it's also part of the American analysis, meaning let's take advantage of this power while it's still here, because the period, let's say, is about to end.
So do you remember there was a very interesting episode of Draconel in this area when he talks about the evolution of American carrier doctrine. This thing is partially true in the sense that if you remember when they built the first ones, so the Lexington and the Saratoga, let's say the twin, the ones with the big smokestack, so Lexington and Saratoga, those were the first ones. Naval aviation was still made up of biplanes. It didn't have the capability to carry very heavy torpedoes. So actually, there was still a reason. I mean, airplanes were seen as little more than small scouting platforms. So the actual operational capability to strike a battleship was very limited. That's why there was still a certain perplessità in investing in aircraft carriers, abandoning what were established and effective solutions like battleships. Then there was this transition when heavier planes arrived capable of carrying heavier torpedoes, bombers. In other words, there was a very rapid transition during the 1930s that changed this philosophy. But we are kind of in this situation where the war in Ukraine and the war in Iran are, in fact, this transition between a technology that is still considered auxiliary, like drones and anti-ship missiles, to a situation where these actually change the scenario from the point of view of weaponry. This is just my opinion as a layman, let's say.
I don't know. Fuller was already writing in the 1920s about the fact that biplanes could carry a torpedo. It's no coincidence that the Bismarck was hit. Yes, the one by Smartfish.
Yes, that's true. But let's say that at the beginning of the 1930s, it wasn't there yet, even though, if you remember, most of the damage at Midway was also done by dive bombers by the Rossi Orlandi. But now, so as not to digress. Okay.
At the beginning of the war, they were terrible, let's say, except for the Japanese long-lance torpedo, but that's a whole different story. But yes, I mean, someone had seen the potential. It was close to practical application, right? The means were there. it would have become stronger and more powerful, kind of like seeing a car in the 1910 or 1915, right? And knowing that inevitably in 20 years it would be faster, it could even be armored. That's what I honestly see in the doors. I see someone who has already thought about the fact that maybe you can even burn some bridges, Giorgio, including the proxies, the ability to project power, because inevitably we'll exploit it, but this resource will eventually run out. So it's better to take everything in now, both from the allies by redistributing the weight of the military burden as well. So withdrawing from there so that everyone pays for themselves, trying to cash in before the inevitable retreat or clash contra la China.
Come on, this sounds more like a gamer's logic than a statesman's, because
to
make use of it, which is basically what Trump is. He's a gamer, he's playing. But if America starts acting like a bully, especially with its allies, relying on the fact that its military power now allows it to do so, and it already knows that tomorrow it won't be able to do so, but excuse me, that's diplomatic suicide, strategic suicide. It means you're becoming weak, and on top of that, you're making enemies for yourself. Right when you're becoming weak is the moment when you need to try to make as many friends as possible.
But anyway, he doesn't think in Amizi's way. He thinks in his own terms, like, in 4 years, I won't be here anyway.
This is my moment to play. I have the toy, I want to use it. I don't want to be like those before me who had the toy and never used it.
I'd like something that we were discussing with Mirko yesterday while chatting on the phone. Now, we have seen that Iranian ballistic missiles have now reached a range of 4,000 kilometers. Does it seem likely that 4,000 could go up to 10,000? I think the leap, especially if the setup involves a navigation system provided by third parties like the Russians or the Chinese, in the end, that's how it is. It's a matter of making bigger tubes with slightly more advanced systems. It's not certain, by the way. I had read some reports that suggested, almost conspiratorially, that North Korea had handed over some intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Let's imagine if he didn't watch the Tehran series too much, where there were Koreans, North Koreans. But you know what the point is, Vardo, if I may interrupt you. If you want to reach 10,000 kilometers, we're not talking about strategic bombing, we're talking about nuclear bombing. Because the ability to carry explosives at those distances exists, but it's minimal. I mean, you fire 100 missiles at me, 10,000 kilometers, what are you going to take out? An airbase?
A data center?
A data center makes more sense.
A data center or a semiconductor factory in Arizona? Those cause damage. They're single points of failure for the entire country. And above all, some very sensitive parts are really objects. And not to mention the psychological impact. With a weapon that an aircraft carrier costs $13.5 billion, how many ballistic missiles can you make with $13.5 billion at today's technology costs? Hi, we don't have to. It's just that thing where biplanes are starting to learn how to use torpedoes. Look, those who develop ballistic missiles are starting to. The Ukrainians are redeveloping ballistic missiles. They used to make them. They made the SS-18s. They were made there in Ukraine. The most prolific ballistic missile ever built. The North Koreans have the technology, and soon the Iranians will have it too. Everyone has it. So having concentrated data centers without any protective umbrella over them is something we need to start considering.
The targets will also change, meaning the targets are no longer aircraft carriers. Maybe it's TSMC, maybe it's the big manufacturers. High-value targets, which are not the classic military objective, but something that is hard to replace.
If you hit ASML in Eindhoven, you've taken out $1 trillion worth of stuff, much more than an aircraft carrier, which, with all due respect, is an object that carries a lot of obsolete technology. If you hit the only company that makes semiconductors, Intel, let's say, in Arizona.
The company is strategic, let's say. It's a perspective similar to the bombing of ball bearing factories in Germany because everything needed ball bearings or plants like Berkut for hydrogenating gasoline, which produced synthetic gasoline in Germany. That's a good question, Giorgio. Do you think there's a hidden plan behind all this that will come out soon? Or is it just a madman who learned from chaos? Because he might also be a bit crazy and play on the fact that he doesn't have a future, so he doesn't care about what he's going to do with the United States and with the world. But is it possible that there isn't, I'm not saying a political counterbalance because he had won by a landslide and so it's hard to oppose him, but is it possible that the civilian and military institutions don't have some way to intervene? There is a clause that states that the head of state is unfit to understand or act.
But it says the vice president must say it.
Post it.
Oh my God.
No.
That's what I was saying before. The American Constitution was basically written in the 1700s and has been modernized very little. The mentality has remained that the president has the power and acts. If the president makes a mistake, the legislative branch steps in afterward.
And you know what they said?
All right, that's the logic.
Maybe one crazy one gets in, but not a second one. What are the chances?
The problem is that they didn't consider the possibility that a crazy president, or simply a cunning one, let's use that word, could also manage to bring the party under his control. Once he has brought the party under his control, in fact, even before becoming president, if he has taken over the party and wins the elections, he has the majority in Congress. And under him, he only has people who are loyal to him. At that point, no one can keep him in check anymore. Thank you. It was never expected that someone like that could ever be elected. But unfortunately, in the age of social media, where you can win people over with good looks and charm, and not necessarily with the mindset of a statesman, unfortunately, this is the situation. So right now, unfortunately, the risk of having a rogue head of state does exist. And those states that don't have a constitutional system capable of keeping him in check are exposed to situations like the one Americans are facing right now. Unfortunately, my answer to that question is that I have personally come to the conclusion that no, he is not controlled by anyone. Just like Putin is not controlled by anyone. They are both figures who have managed to achieve almost absolute power. And they do whatever they want based on their personal beliefs and judgments. No one can limit their power, so they are in a position to do a lot of harm. They are convinced they are doing the right thing.
We're in good shape. Someone mentioned Stephen Miller, and now there's a controversy going around that he hid behind his pregnant wife, huh?
But could I return briefly to the earlier discussion about the missiles?
Yes, please.
I found it very interesting.
Much more interesting than Stephen Miller hiding behind his pregnant wife.
No.
Yeah, John did an amazing bit about that. You should watch Jon Stewart. He's really hilarious.
The point about missiles now costing less than aircraft carriers is absolutely true. But I would say that the reaction to all this is already largely underway. Because if we look at the world right now, the most important arms race is precisely about air defense and anti-missile capability. It's the most sought after thing, the most sophisticated thing, and it's what nations try to have before anything else. Ukraine first and foremost. The first thing it asks for is air defense. Even though in reality for them it's not at all essential for conducting the war. because it doesn't have a direct impact on operations at the front, but it still has such a huge political impact that it is their main objective to be able to achieve credible air defense. And that's what we're focusing on as well here in Europe. Now, as there is a race for ballistic missiles, there is also a race for air defense. And at this point, probably the group of powers, the alliance of powers that manages to achieve a more credible integrated air defense system will probably be the one that manages to secure the dominant global strategic position. To this, we must add a second level of importance, which are the bases, the availability of bases on a global level. Because the famous discussion about air gates is that air gates have great relevance when there is also a large availability of bases scattered around the planet. Because in fact, when the Ford operating in the Red Sea has a problem and has to return all the way to Norfolk, at that point the Ford is useless. But if instead the Ford can afford to stop at Suda Bay, then no, then it still has its value. So when a nation has airspace defense, especially against missiles and bases scattered around the world, it's a power that has potential for growth on a strategic level. Question. The United States has a certain significant anti-ballistic defense capability. However, if they were to leave NATO, they would lose their bases. Because let's remember that most American bases are actually located in British and French territories. The islands scattered around the world are British and French. So in the end, ironically, the power equipped with anti-ballistic capabilities and bases scattered around the world is Europe.
In fact, I've always wondered why the Chinese are so obsessed with these damn aircraft carriers, considering that their opponent is theoretically only 60 kilometers from their coast. In my opinion, it's partly because of the trend among all countries, like Germany, which built one of the largest navies in World War I, even though it had the smallest colonies of all the states. What the hell was it doing with the Imperial German Navy, which couldn't even get out of the ports from Denmark?
The commercial struggle, Germany was importing, etc. So 20 battleships and 12 cruisers.
They weren't enough.
Non sono bastate.
No, because England had more. But what Giorgio said is absolutely true. You need bases, because if you don't have them with these magnificent aircraft carriers, you'll just take a little trip around the small island in front of your house and you won't get anywhere. Bases borrowed, as we would say where I'm from former colonial powers, because they are colonial legacies. Then there's Diego Garcia, these places here. Let's not kid ourselves.
France has more than England.
Yes, actually, yes. It has more of them scattered around, even in Oceania, in the area of New Caledonia, these areas here. A few words about Palantir. Lately, there's been a lot going on, even in the field of support and artificial intelligence. The Pentagon and others, let's say, quite interesting figures. A small note, while you were talking about missiles, it's true that there's a lot of research going on. On the defensive side, though, the Americans, a bit behind on hypersonics, seem to want to bring in the Dark Eagle system. Speaking of the article I was showing you from a newspaper, notice that newspapers are... I'm glad to see that the quality level is terrible even abroad, not just in Italy. Middle East Eye, and they even put an IMARS. All right.
There's probably something... I don't know much about it. I know they developed a system for identifying uppercase letters, which is what ended up at that school, believing it. A military asset, however, has recently come out. Instead, something very interesting about their Chinese equivalent, which does more or less the same kind of work, basically collects information from social media and creates it. They managed, for example, and believe it or not, given how heavily monitored Chinese society is, to track the B-2s simply by doing OSINT and by tracing the civilian communications between the B2S and control towers at various airports. So, by mixing, let's say, various pieces of information, air traffic, communications with airports, and various other data, they basically managed to track some of the assets.
Marco, no offense, but I caught you. I said they would attack the last week of February, and I got the exact day. It's not like you need to be Marconi to figure it out. They were moving 150 planes. The whole world saw them. It was easy. There were vehicles moving, even the forces.
Knowing where they are at that moment and what they're doing is a whole different story, especially organizing all this information. It's one thing to know in a general sense. It's another thing to have an idea of the position of the assets, what they're doing, and that's a whole different story. And it means, for example, let's take the example of the guy who drives by in a car and uses code words to say what he just noticed on the runway or parked near the hangars of a military base somewhere in the Middle East or at other sensitive airports.
So let's say the carriers are not in the harbor.
Well, in fact, no.
That's what the Japanese spy said to Perlabo. It seems big to me.
Of putting all this together. However, the Japanese also lost track of the position at the most important moment. Do you remember the famous seaplane that was supposed to land, found it guarded by them, and obviously couldn't refuel? And so they didn't know that the carriers had already left the port. We're talking about Midway. We're mentioning Midway. It's something for, let's say, history nerds. But the point is precisely the OSINT systems. Systems that integrate information coming from many apparently irrelevant sources. Basically, the secrecy and opacity of information are now disappearing.
None. Maybe that's why ballistic missiles are coming back. You know exactly where they start from. You know exactly where they'll land. Because you can really calculate the trajectory with a Motorola. Speaking of Nerd 68.020. But then try to intercept it.
I'm not completely in agreement with Giorgio on some things because I believe that the battle against missiles is won, especially with the maneuverable ones and so on. It's not a lost battle, but it's one where you're always a step behind. Because you have to think about what a wild horse will do. I'm referring, for example, to hypersonic missiles. You basically have to guess what a wild horse will do. And this race will keep increasing the energy budget. That is, an interceptor always needs more and more energy. It becomes increasingly expensive. You have to hit it in the very early phase or towards the terminal phase because the intermediate phases become unmanageable. And I don't know, I see it as an uphill race, very difficult.
Like a glide vehicle, a vehicle that really becomes a mess.
LGV or even worse, true hypersonic ones, so to speak. I see it as a race that's always one step behind, always a step back in this battle between cannon and armor. And direct energy weapons might not be the solution. The electromagnetic ones have shown significant barrel wear. Let's remember what the Japanese are doing now. They still have a lot of problems to solve, and it's not clear if they'll ever solve them. So unless someone comes up with something revolutionary in the field of direct energy, I don't see it.
This also answers the question of why at least jamming isn't so much easier than actually hitting it. What do you think about anti-air laser weapons in the future? Actually, first of all, you don't have enough time to hit an object moving at max 7, max 10, max 12 with a laser. You simply don't have the time to get it done. Pay attention to this. What you see being used now in Israeli experimental trials takes 45 seconds before it burns a drone, so it needs time. It's a matter of power.
It's a problem of accumulated power. If you had a laser that does 100 megawatts, the problem is that you need a power source with 100 megawatts of energy to fire basically in a tenth of a second. You need to recharge it.
I imagine.
The capacitors do that job.
But let's assume you have them, since we don't like to say these things. And you place this anti-ballistic missile laser cannon. How many would you need to cover, for example, Italy, considering the dispersion?
There's a problem with atmospheric dispersion, obviously, because theoretically you could place just a few, but it depends on the range of these devices. It depends on atmospheric diffusion. So it depends on how high you want to hit them. There's another problem. Theoretically, you could defend a missile with a smoke screen, making it release a diffusion of plasma around it that deflects. Maybe I'm talking nonsense, but that's what people are thinking. For example, in low visibility conditions like in fog or when it's raining like this, a laser loses a lot of its energy, so you attack when it starts to rain. Say goodbye, let's start getting ready. I don't know, Giorgio, what do you think about this whole issue of the offense-defense battle over missiles?
It's a layman's view.
I don't know.
It's a layman's view, considering that I'm technically, engineering-wise, a dinosaur. It's better if I keep quiet, but that's just my impression. My feeling is that the anti-missile fight will go on two tracks in the coming 30 to 50 years. One will be the railguns. So we will use simple kinetic energy projectiles at extremely high speed, which will guarantee point defense against anything that gets through. The upper shield is represented by interceptor missiles, which, as you said, will always be very expensive. Then, of course, there will be orbit-based weapons, because the hope is to stop ballistic missiles, meaning the ones that go like this, and not cruise missiles that fly low, but ballistic missiles. The solution is to stop them from space at the moment when they are at the peak of their orbit. And here too, we're heading in this direction. Yes, we're moving towards laser weapons, in any case, directed energy. We're moving towards large satellites with big accumulators. And I don't know what kind of generators they'll put on board. Probably in the end, they'll even be nuclear.
Giorgio, proprio, you see, then we move forward.
The militarization of space.
They become connected, right? Lately, Musk wanted to put solar panels in space because he says you basically don't have to do any maintenance. And they recharge 24 hours a day, so you could even recharge directly on site, let's say. Then we need to see how much it can actually produce to power Uras. Of course, this would make the characters happy. Well, it was needed because everyone wanted the laser-on. This discussion is very much about the laser-on, but yes, that's probably the future. Satellite constellations, something is already being experimented with, many more satellites doing tracking, and maybe we could even shoot from one side. And then it depends on the speed of the object, because it's not easy. But despite this, I've seen the Americans now move the Dark Eagle system, forse contro l'Iran. Assimilation, Viajonith. What they're using isn't just Dark Eagle, it's something more. Depetcholiu. Iranian interceptions, I think it's more for experimenting, an excuse to test it in a real environment. And that's because Iran has interception capabilities beyond the Bavar 373, beyond what some of her professors have, which aren't exactly the best. So, also, to keep it short, in conclusion, I think Trump won't care about the extension. He'll do pretty much what he wants. And honestly, I think the Iranians don't want to give in, also because the main point is the nuclear issue. No more, no less, they've spread it around the country. The Americans know very well that you can't go and retrieve it. They don't want it going around. And surely the Americans don't agree to give them to Russia, because Russia would then hand them over. They go in, they come out the other revolving door. I think that for Trump, among the most obvious and stupid things for Trump, there's a round of attacks, thinking that with the same recipe as before, it will change something. That's my take.
Also because by doing so, he has fun.
Instead, I read an opinion, a rather warped idea, which was not liked at all. Robert Polk, an analyst and professor at Scuola University, said that Trump needs the support of the Russians to open the strait. So he could even put pressure on European allies to withdraw support for Ukraine in exchange for support. That's an opinion. There's one thing, a scenario, though, I would suggest to him. Let's say for now, let's not give him any ideas.
Let's hope Trump never listened to him.
It was on NBC too much, unfortunately. They beat us to the story.
But he already tried. What further pressure can he apply?
Exactly, I don't see the theory. Considering how little Russia wanted to interfere with the attack, that's true, in quotes. Yet another ally after Venezuela.
By the way, the Iranians are involved, so they're there, and we also need to see what happens in the Gulf. Because let's remember that this move by the UAE leaving OPEC is a very, very strong signal, both for the oil producers cartel and also a bit for the largest investment fund in the area. It's not Saudi, but let's say it's Emirati, so.
Lì vuol dire che qualcosa there could be a cascade of other countries wanting to break away, also because they need to recover what they're losing. Now, if you break away from the fixed price, you can set it more or less as you want. There's also another point. They've been struggling with this issue for a long time. Here comes the first good opportunity. The other point is what Giorgio Alfaras rightly said. I can't recall if you were there too, Giorgio. If the crisis lasts a month, it gets absorbed into the yearly average. But if it lasts longer, countries start finding other solutions and then they don't go back. Yes.
But for example, there was, even if you look, they're still doing it anyway. The Saudis are building pipelines to cross the entire Saudi Arabia, and there's also another one heading north.
They have low capacity, 4 million, something like that.
Not more than that. Once you have the pipeline built, installing bigger pipes takes time, but will they get ready for Iran then? This is something that matters now for the next few months, after which the whole Gulf will adapt accordingly to bypass all the problems of.
You were talking about earlier.
In my opinion, the problem is you go from one danger to another because, okay, you bypass the Iran mess, you bypass the Houthi problem. When you leave the Red Sea, who do you see ahead of you? It's that they're watching us, and it's not just that they're there, they're really watching us. Then it's not just that, it's that they put themselves right in front of us with their little boats. Give us a few billion. It's really become easy to cause trouble.
But for this, you don't need a navy with 300 very expensive ships. You need one with 600 smaller units, able to guarantee and probably also with granular capability to intervene in the places where these things can happen. The problem is that if you have a few very expensive units, you can't guarantee continuous patrolling. I remember in the 80s, there were articles I used to read, the United States towards the Navy. Of the 600 ships, now they have fewer than 300, and they will drop below 300 in the coming years with the decommissioning programs they have. And this at a time when the routes are becoming more and more dangerous.
Sorry, I interrupted myself. I tend to see things from a strategic point of view, meaning I see the mistakes made in Europe. Buying all our gas from one country, which as we've seen wasn't the best idea, we pretended to turn a blind eye, as if Abkhazia, Ossetia, Chechnya, and so on had never happened. And I noticed that the Gulf countries more or less live with a similar dependency, meaning they're essentially countries that rely on one or two resources and everything is very centralized. But we've also seen this from an energy perspective. Kuwait, Bahrain. These places have just a few huge power plants because I imagine it's easier to centralize, sorry for the wordplay, centralize the plants so you have one big one that's easier to manage. But then strategically, if the enemy takes down just one power plant, you lose 30% of the country's electricity. So that's the choice these countries make when they go for the easier option, the one that's easier to manage in the short term. But it makes you extremely vulnerable to changes. In my opinion, these choices were driven by 30 years of so-called peace. And now instead, suddenly you have to start thinking about diversifying suppliers, diversifying your energy sources, even internal ones, and probably even military production. In this sense, you can't centralize everything. Earlier, Marco was saying if you hit a manufacturer of lithography machines, you cause $1 trillion in damages. In this world, centralization just to save money is becoming a huge vulnerability.
Can I add something about this? We are dealing with what is happening in Europe, so that's the context we're working within. No, there are no bosses here. The producer's resolution is one, and that's how the city had the chance to be supplied with nitrocarbons. And also with Russia, because they're really desperate, they're in a really bad situation too. Not to mention the whole room. Then in Indonesia, but Sri Lanka until a few months ago accepted diesel that met European standards, 10 parts per million. Then they said, okay, up to 500 per million. Now, as I was saying, they say, give us whatever you have, because at this point, we'll take anything. We're desperate.
In Japan and Korea, they were 70 to 80% dependent on exports.
Imagine the impact on these countries, because we always just look over there toward Europe, but a large part of the world, the center of the technology world today, which even China depends on, by the way, and India?
India too.
But in India, there are ships sailing. They say there's a certain traffic along the coast, let's say.
Yes, a mutual friend whom we greet.
Awesome.
He just confirmed this thing to me about this traffic.
Mr. C.
Let me just pick up on what you were saying earlier about the possible plan for Trump to ask Russia for help in exchange for pressuring Europe to stop supporting Ukraine. Here, however, the risk I see is different, because the way I see it, Russia can't really do anything to help Trump reopen the strait. Yes, so asking for something huge without getting anything in return. I don't see it as very likely. But there's another possibility, because the one who can actually do something is China. Let's say hello to them, being able to give something in return to China, che non alla Russia. Because giving something in return to Russia requires being able to bend Europe, which they've already tried to do, and it didn't work. Whereas to do a favor for China, it's about bending someone else, someone a bit less robust. It could be called the Philippines, it could be called Vietnam, it could be called Indonesia, it could be called Italy. Yes, South Korea already with Japan becomes more difficult, but still, China is definitely able to get something from America much more easily than Russia is. And at the same time, China is also able to put pressure on Iran, with more success than Russia can, which has already shown its impotence in the region, while China, at least from an economic point of view, is able to do a lot. Iran will need to be rebuilt, and Iran knows very well that it won't be Russia helping it rebuild. China, on the other hand, has all the capabilities to rebuild Iran. So Iran is more likely to respond to pressure from Beijing to moderate, which also has its own personal interest rather than those from Russia. And at the same time, for Trump, it's easier to satisfy China, for example, by abandoning Taiwan than to satisfy Russia, because he's not able to convince Europe to stop supporting Ukraine.
By the way, there was a Russian proposal, because if you remember 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, the Russians were saying, what if we give Venezuela to the Americans in exchange for help? I mean, there was something to trade at the time. I've always wondered, if the Americans want to take Venezuela, technically it's only a 30-minute flight from home. I don't think they need the Russians' approval. I mean, you trade something when the other side prevents you from taking it, and then there's a quid pro quo. In that case, there wasn't any quid pro quo. But it shows that in any case, these ideas are in the air on one side. Yes, on the other side.
Unfortunately, yes.
Here you go. Gentlemen, what can I say? I feel sorry for Daniele, who probably smashed his phone in a fit of rage, but we'll get another Giuntano. Don't worry, this story isn't over. It's not over either. Eat in peace, more or less. So don't eat in the car because it's better to eat at home, move around less. Because in any case, the solutions are either a counter-blockade, which sooner or later leads to an even bigger crisis, or a resumption of attacks that will inevitably lead to nothing. Because it's not like they collapse, give up, or anything like that. On the contrary, there will probably be a measured Iranian response wherever they can in other areas. So everything more or less stays the same, unless Trump, he could wake up one morning and say, mission accomplished and go home. Even though this time, I think he's put himself out there too much to be able to pull back in an orderly way, let's say. Unfortunately, the Venezuelan recipe didn't work here. A small note that I always add at the end, because let's not forget that in all this mess, Israel also had a big piece of the pie, and they keep relentlessly carrying out their own plan. And they really do have a plan, because these guys, like the Russians, don't even go to the bathroom without a plan. So we end with the last of the quotes from The Hunt for Red October, and they're fine with everything. In fact, now they're even helping the United Arab Emirates with Iron Dome and probably with military contracts that will bring the Gulf countries even closer together. I don't know how well they read this situation, because it's pretty clear that it's the Israelis who dragged the Americans into the idea, and yet now the Gulf monarchies are seeking help, quote unquote, from Israel. It's not like Israeli bases wouldn't attract the attention of the Iranians just like American bases do, so it's not exactly clear. However, evidently the Abraham Accords seem to be much stronger than everything else that's happening, Gaza and everything else. Money doesn't stink, we'll see. Thank you all very much. Thanks to the Colonel, thanks to Marco Bussi Moro for what he was able to do, thanks to those 5 frames. And to Paolo, who unfortunately couldn't make it, but he'll catch up. Good night to everyone.
Bye. Good night.
Good night.